War has always been the mother of invention, wrote historian A.J.P. Taylor. The First World War, in particular, is often taken to be a hinge in technological history. The war in which horses were widely used for the last time and weapons of mass destruction were deployed for the first time. It is not altogether wrong to think of it as the chemists' war or the engineers' war, as it is sometimes labeled. However, the centenary of the Great War provides an occasion to explore the ways in which the truth is rather subtler than the conventional wisdom. With a few notable exceptions, most of the iconic technologies of the First World War were not in fact invented during or because of the war. Rather, they were modifications of existing civilian technologies developed during peacetime. Nor did the war effort engender many truly transformative technological innovations, even those for which the war is most famous. In this sense, World War I was not the mother of invention. But the war was a turning point in another, far less understood way. As we shall see, the greatest invention of World War I was not so much any particular machine, but the war machine itself. In the United States especially, the war helped assemble the loosely connected elements of technology, industry, academic science, and government into the first glimmerings of what President Eisenhower would later dub the military-industrial complex. In telling this story, we will focus on two integral American figures, the chemist and chemical engineer Arthur D. Little, who championed the idea of industrial research, which would come to play a key role not just in advancing corporate competitiveness, but also in the new technologies of warfare. And the astronomer George Ellery Hale, who successfully campaigned to create the National Research Council, thereby elevating the authority of science as an enterprise vital to the public good. Crucial to these changes were the twin goals of integrating science into industrial research and a transformation of academic science into a professionalized discipline deserving large-scale political and financial support. To be sure, the myriad technological advances associated with the First World War are an important part of this story, even if such advances are too often thought of as taking place in the vacuum of war. The many technological innovations most prominently associated with World War I may be grouped into three categories. First, weapons technologies invented for, or in cases improved upon, or scaled specifically for warfighting. Second, medical innovations occasioned by the war's traumas. And third, non-weapons technologies catalyzed by or commercialized because of the war more generally. An exhaustive catalogue of wartime technology is beyond the scope of this video, but a brief survey will suffice to show that the war did not cause the invention, as such, of many of its best-known technologies. Let us start with the weapons. The sinking in May 1915 of the British ocean liner Lusitania, resulting in the deaths of more than 1,000 passengers, over 100 of them American citizens, is remembered now as the event that began the chipping away of anti-war sentiment in the United States. It also epitomized one of the war's most famous technologies, the submarine. Although the submarine was not a German invention and even predated the war by half a century, it is one of the technologies most closely identified with the war. Early Allied attempts to overcome Germany's advantage in underwater operations were reminiscent of old military concepts. Ramming, for example, was considered a tactic of choice early on. The German submarine stranglehold was not broken until the adoption of a technology invented earlier for civilian use, the hydrophone. When combined with the development of the hydrostatically triggered depth charge, this allowed the Allies to detect, locate, and destroy submerged German submarines. Like the submarine, the machine gun had existed for decades before the war. Though machine guns had evolved considerably, more important was their widespread availability, which contributed to the stalemate of the trench warfare on the Western Front. Machine guns were also used in novel ways. For example, they could be mounted on airplanes thanks to a clever innovation, the interrupter gear, which synchronized the gun's firing with the plane's propellers so that the bullets would not hit the propeller's blades. The First World War has sometimes been called an artillery war, for instance by military historian John Terrain in his 1982 book White Heat. According to some estimates, shell fire caused 60 to 70% of all battle casualties. But when there were many refinements in artillery and shell-related technologies during this period, The shrapnel shell, which contributed terrifyingly to the grisly brutality of the war, was originally developed in the 1780s by Henry Shrapnel, the Briton for whom it is named. The fragmentation hand grenade, the tank, and chemical weapons are better candidates for genuine inventions of the Great War. The Mills bomb, as it came to be called in Britain, was introduced in 1915 by Sir William Mills. However, his design improved on an earlier model developed by Belgian Army Captain Leon Roland. Meanwhile, the tank combined the earlier inventions of high-strength steel and the internal combustion engine, all in service of overcoming barbed wire, trenches, and machine guns. But while the tank did make its battlefield debut during the conflict, it was not produced or deployed in large numbers and remained of marginal tactical effectiveness. Its true potential would not be realized until the Second World War. The Great War is often referred to as the Chemists' War in a nod to the horrific legacy of chemical weapons. The first large-scale and widely reported chemical attack was on April 22, 1915, when German forces released chlorine gas in Ypres, Belgium. Allied troops, engulfed by the cloud of poison, found themselves drowning on dry land as their lungs filled with fluid. Their skin and eyes seared by the chemical as they grasped painfully for air and coughed up a greenish froth flecked with blood. An eyewitness quoted in the New York Times described the effect on soldiers as, "Without doubt, the most awful form of scientific torture. The use of gases escalated from there, with both sides deploying chemical weapons until the war's end." Chemists helped develop novel types of poison gas, from mustard gas used by the Germans to Lusitania, invented by the Americans but never used during the war. Through the invention of such terrible weapons and the development of the associated wartime research, chemists certainly played an infamous role in the war effort. But beyond adapting chemistry as a tool for killing, the war saw few, if any, major inventions in chemical engineering. The famous Haber-Bosch process, for example, a method for synthesizing ammonia from hydrogen and nitrogen, which Germany used in manufacturing its explosives, was developed for industrial purposes several years before the war began. It is in the next two categories, medicine and technologies, other than weapons, that we find an array of advances, the impact of which would be felt most in the lives of ordinary citizens long after the war. During the war, medical care followed patterns of innovation similar to those of weapons technology, with wartime needs making it vital to extend and improve upon existing tools and practices. For example, though X-ray machines date to the late 19th century, the first mobile X-ray machines were deployed during World War I. Marie Curie herself helped equip the vehicles. Similarly, the war saw the widespread use of the cellulose bandage, which had been previously invented in the civilian sector and which collaterally led to the sanitary napkin. Motorized ambulances pioneering the concept of rapid evacuation to dramatically improve speed to treatment and blood transfusions. In the 19th century, blood transfusions were rare and dangerous, but a dozen years before the war, the mystery of why some transfusions were successful while others were deadly was solved. There are a few different blood types, some of which are incompatible. While such knowledge was not new in 1914, World War I was the first time it was widely put to use, with tens of thousands of wounded men receiving transfusions. The war also saw advances in blood preservation, and in an attempt to meet the need for donations, the creation of what are often considered the world's first blood banks. There were, however, some notable medical advances born out of the war. In fact, medicine arguably had a higher proportion of innovations resulting directly from war, partly because of the introduction of deadly modern weapons. The traumatized behavior of many soldiers returning from the front lines, tremors, hypersensitivity, confusion, lassitude, a 1,000-yard stare, became known as shell shock, what today's medical researchers now call combat stress reaction. As Peter Lees explains in his 2002 book Shell Shock, while early treatments for shell shock were of limited effectiveness, post-war press attention to the problem led to major advances in the 1920s and 30s. Similarly, modern plastic surgery was pioneered because of the injuries from high-explosive fragmentation ordnance, as was the splinting of broken femurs. The latter resulted in the associated fatality rate dropping from about 80% to 20%. Even Sir Alexander Fleming's invention of penicillin can be substantially linked to the Great War, though it did not come for a decade after the war's end. Fleming credited his experience in battlefield hospitals to his later research. Indeed, the war functioned like a vast laboratory for the implementation and testing of not only organizational and administrative techniques for medical treatment, but also the various contagion theories of disease that had been hotly debated in the medical community during the decades preceding the war. The third category of innovations associated with the Great War, non-weapon, non-medical technologies, exhibits most explicitly the pattern of innovation we have seen in the first two categories. Though the roots of these discoveries and inventions mostly precede the war, the needs of warfare made advancement or modification urgent, while the magnitude of demand stimulated industrial-scale production. For example, early versions of hydrophones were originally used for navigation, and then in the wake of the sinking of Titanic in 1912, were adapted for locating icebergs. But the demands of submarine warfare required that this technology be militarized and commercialized. Similarly, the Englishman Harry Beerley invented rustless or stainless steel in 1913, just before the war, making possible modern aircraft engines as well as better dining utensils and medical instruments. Other examples include the zipper, promptly adopted by producers of aviator suits and sleeping bags, secure optical communications, the heliograph, daylight savings time to save energy, the tea bag, the first widespread and institutional distribution of condoms, and the wristwatch, which became a common issue for soldiers and which many veterans continued to wear after the war. While the First World War began the full military integration of real-time communications, the telegraph had been used in a number of wars since the 1850s. Wireless telegraphy and the radio antedated the war by more than a decade, but during the war years, the necessary technology was made more portable and thus suitable for use in the field and at sea. The war also led to the first rudimentary advances in radio communication between airplanes and the ground, field telephone systems allowing communications with the front lines, and in some small ways hinted at the possible use of radio for broadcasting. Also new with the First World War was the use of personal cameras on the front lines in the hands of individual soldiers and civilians, allowing for a higher volume of candid photographs than had been possible in earlier wars and making war photography a new feature of newspapers and propaganda. Airplanes also typified this burgeoning industrial military model. The aircraft was famously invented more than a decade before the First World War by two civilians, the Wright brothers. But the militarization of airplanes led to some of the war's most dramatic and memorable episodes, especially with the high drama of aerial dogfights. Germany's Red Baron remains a legend to this day. Still, although all the world's militaries would eventually add air forces to their armies and navies, during the First World War, air power was not yet strategically essential. Interestingly, a pilotless drone took flight and landed successfully for the first time on March 6, 1918, a US Navy project to be abandoned a few years later, awaiting the emergence of the necessary associated technologies. The technological innovations that would be put to use for the military were largely due not to science, but rather to industry and industrial engineering, which is why the war is perhaps most aptly called a war of engineers. As English physicist and engineer John Ambrose Fleming said in a 1915 lecture, it is beyond any doubt that this war is a war of engineers and chemists quite as much as of soldiers, and to win this war, we have to achieve engineering feats. And a 1918 article in the Scientific Monthly explained that the existing war is essentially a war of engineers, for it is they who are manufacturing the guns, ammunition, vessels, motors, and the other paraphernalia requisite for carrying on the struggle, and who are attending to the transportation of men, munitions, food, and all other supplies by both land and sea, besides doing their fair share of the fighting. Over the course of the war, scientists came to play an increasingly essential role in industrial research, directing and advising military leaders, politicians, industrialists, and technicians, thereby creating the modern model of corporate and government research and development. Throughout the 19th century, American businesses had ably harnessed the power of the technologies of the Industrial Revolution, pioneering and mastering the art of mass production. By the time war broke out in Europe, Taylorism had been boosting factory efficiency across the country, and Henry Ford had already sold hundreds of thousands of his mass-produced Model Ts. All told, America's manufacturing output had risen from 7.2% of the world total in 1860 to 32% in 1913. Against the backdrop of such industrial success, it must have sounded strange when in 1913, Arthur D. Little argued for the necessity of a new industrial model. He said, "Modern progress can no longer depend upon accidental discoveries. Each advance in industrial science must be studied, organized, and fought like a military campaign." What Little rightly perceived was that the Western world was becoming engulfed by a new wave of industrialization, one less dependent on the mechanical arts of old than on the new sciences of chemistry and electricity. Chemistry, for example, had begun to play a crucial role in the large-scale production of disinfectants, dyes, fertilizers, plastics, and photography, while electricity was indispensable for telephony, illumination, and the radio. Little argued that it was necessary for American industries based on a dedicated internal scientific research department. Today, it is hard to imagine any large business enterprise, whether McDonald's, Walmart, General Motors, or Google, lacking corporate research and development. So integral is it to our conception of technological advancement and competitive advantage. Few people were better positioned to see the need for this new model than the Bostonian Little. He founded one of the first independent commercial research laboratories and became a pioneer in the new field of chemical engineering. Little pointed to a few exemplars of the new industrial research model: Thomas Edison's General Electric labs, as well as those of AT&T, Westinghouse Electric, DuPont, Eastman Kodak, and several prominent German firms. And it was too a war of factories and farms aiming to outproduce the enemy. Before entering the war, the United States supplied the Allies with food, materials, and equipment, and then, after 1917, overwhelmed the Central Powers with sheer quantity of machinery it put in play. Such quantity of force left Germany at a severe disadvantage in the later stages of the war and was a significant factor in its demoralization and subsequent surrender in August 1918. Industrial means of production thus became means of warfare. Moreover, thanks to the emergence of the commercial laboratory, industrial research became the means of innovation, directing businesses to respond to the new technological needs of the military. In time, American industry would see the full imprint of Little's concept of research, so that when the Second World War broke out, the American military and government were able to not only leverage an existing and enormous infrastructure, but also to co-opt the emergence of an entirely new and powerful complex of directed industrial, technological, and increasingly scientific research. While in the years leading up to the war, industry had begun to harness scientific research for commerce and warfare, the potential usefulness of science for the public good was still widely underappreciated. This too was about to change. In the aftermath of Lusitania's May 1915 sinking, the US Secretary of the Navy turned to famed American inventor and businessman Thomas Edison for help in creating a coalition of the nation's keenest and most inventive minds, which together with Edison's own wonderful brain would find a new technological means of combating the submarine. Within 3 months, Edison had assembled the Naval Consulting Board, a panel of distinguished inventors, engineers, and scientists. The use of scientific research by every department of the federal government has become a commonplace, if not always uncontroversial, feature of modern political life. But in 1915, it was still rare for the government to request outside technical expertise in this way. One figure who found this state of affairs unacceptable was the American astronomer George Ellery Hale, who would be pivotal in the outward turn of American science, in its professionalization and its rising public role. Starting in 1913, Hale wrote a series of articles for the journal Science, laying out his vision for the Academy. But the war would become the most important catalyst for major change at the Academy. By June 1916, a new arm of the Academy had been established, the National Research Council. During the remainder of the war, the Council, with Hale as its first chairman, provided topographical information to the Army War College, helped the Army Signal Corps better its capacity for sound ranging, a technique for determining the location of enemy artillery pieces, advised the Navy on improving its rangefinders, worked with manufacturers to help determine where botanical raw materials necessary for production could be found, and much more. Hale wrote to President Wilson later in the war, to warn that America could not compete successfully with Germany in war or peace unless they utilize science to the full for military and industrial purposes. This was no longer a platitude. As evidence of the fecundity and necessity of scientific research, he could point out to the work of scientists on the council, who were developing weapons, tools, and techniques for all fronts, from the submarine to chemical warfare. Science was becoming more public and more professional. It was also becoming more practical. Within a year, the National Research Council had its principal financial gifts in hand. With support from the likes of the Carnegie Corporation, Henry Ford, and the Rockefeller Foundation, large-scale scientific research had the funding, the institutional position, and the governmental mandate that would allow it to outlive the Great War. Though by no means devoid of conflict or economic turmoil, the half-century preceding the First World War saw rapid economic growth and intensifying interconnectivity in the United States and much of Europe, with a dazzling array of new goods, services, and comforts, as well as new lines of transportation, communication, and commerce. But any hopes for a lasting era of global peace and prosperity were lost in the blood and smoke of the war. The war's major operations were some of the deadliest in history, with tens of thousands of soldiers sometimes dying in a single day. The sites of some of the battles still resonate in our cultural memory. Verdun, the Somme, the Marne, Ypres. With a total of 10 million soldiers and perhaps 7 million civilians dead on all sides, is it any surprise that British soldier and poet Wilfred Owen labeled Horace's famous line, "That old lie, sweet and fitting is it to die for one's country." The political ideas which generated this war, the theories of national interest, prestige, honor, patriotism, are not the products of science, but territory which science still has to conquer. All in all, as British historian of science and technology D.S.L. Cardwell concludes in his 1975 article, as Cardwell points out, even on the battlefield, the record of science was, with the exception of the use of poison gas, a good one. None of the main weapons could be ascribed to recent scientific research, while many medical advances could be. Paradoxically then, science, though it had attained its newfound status partly by integrating itself into large-scale industrial and technological research projects, many specifically for military purposes, remained insulated from the general disenchantment associated with the war. A possible explanation for this seeming paradox, that science achieved such an exalted status during the war but remained insulated from the general disillusionment that war brought, is that science, despite the efforts of Hale and his comrades, was at that time still far more removed from technology. It would be an error of prolepsis to project back onto World War I and the years leading up to it our more recent notion of the military-industrial complex. But several trends that were already underway when the war began, including industrialization, the commercialization of research laboratories, the professionalization of science, and the belief that science ought to serve some public purpose, came together as never before to meet the urgent demands of the belligerent nations. The American economy became, for the first time, a modern war machine, a science and technology-centric industrial model that would come into full force during World War II. During the Cold War, the relationship between science, technology, and government continued to broaden and deepen, including the establishment of a system in which the federal government became a mainstay of funding for research and development. It remains to be seen whether the technological and geopolitical developments of our own era, from new kinds of weapons and warfare to new kinds of institutions and international norms, will tighten or fracture the linkage between science, technology, industry, and the national interest. Thank you for watching. Like this video if you liked it. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you will enjoy my other video essays. My name is I will see you in the next video. Bye.